My name is Macleod. I'm also known as Startup CFO. For the last 11 years I've been leading finance for angel and VC-backed startups. I'm currently CFO at Akoa, StatusNet, and Tungle, and an advisor to a bunch of other startups, pretty much focused exclusively on web and software as a service. There's a real range of tech startups in Montreal, so I'm focused a lot on web. So that's the ones that I see the most of. But if you go back, I mean, we've got a real legacy in a few different sectors in Montreal. You know, traditionally have been very strong in images, graphic design. I think of companies like Soft2Manage, Discrete Logic, very strong in gaming. And in fact, all of the big gaming studios have satellite offices here, and that's kind of spawned a whole kind of ecosystem around that of gaming startups. But I would say where I see lots of action these days is consumer internet and also kind of business facing software as a service startups. I see a lot of those. Yeah, great question. I think there are a ton of startups in Montreal, and many of them kind of fly below the radar screen, to be honest. You know, if you look, and it's important not just to look at who's got funding, because there's many people who are doing things on a bootstrap basis and you don't hear about them for a while, but there's a ton of folks that do that. And so I'm very close with Montreal Startup, which is a local micro seed fund. And just in the 2 years that it's been operational, it alone has funded 15 companies, but it looked at 500 companies in order to get there. And it can only invest here. So that gives you some sense. And that, by the way, is just in web, right? Because we really only do web startups, so that's really, and software. So just here, 500 individual companies pass through Montreal Startup's doors in order for it to make the 15 investments, and that's just one fund. And then you think of other funds who are really active, like Innovia Capital, where it's a similar kind of ratio, just magnified because they have 10 times the size of a fund that Montreal Startup does. And then you have other folks who are really just on a kind of bootstrapping it to never need to go through those doors. A company I know really well out in Hudson named SiteZugo, really doing really well, self-funded, talk management, but all the way out, self-funded, Talker app, kind of. So there's a bunch of folks who are starting things, and of course it's faster and cheaper to do that these days. So a lot of people are starting things on the side all the time that sometimes blossom into real companies. You know, it starts off as a little project or a little idea and then turns into a great company. So I'm seeing tons and tons of new activity these days. And certainly when you go outside of Montreal, if you look at sites like a Startup Index, which is run by the Startup North folks in Toronto. So I have an RSS feed of Startup Index just so I can see which new companies are added. And we're seeing about 5 new companies getting added every week. Tons of volume. How many startups reach all the way to exit? That's a tough one. And I think it's important, again, to differentiate, to separate out self-funded businesses from ones that go through angel and particularly venture capital. And I think on the self-funded side, I don't really have good statistics because it's not the space that I've been playing in. But I do know of, you know, a lot of companies. And you know, on that side, I see folks building businesses with single-digit $1 million in revenue. They're great businesses, and they're worth, you know, maybe $5-6 million. And if someone takes you out for that, I mean, it's chump change for a VC, but it's life-changing for an entrepreneur. So they're perfectly valid businesses. They're great. I think on the funded side, we have had a real challenge in achieving exits. And there have been some good ones, but we need to do a much better job at systematically achieving exits. And we're starting to see some improvements there. Just last week, there were 3 exits announced in Canada alone. One of them was in town here, Standout. So hopefully we're going to get much better at that. I really don't have a good sense for a percentage. I can say that, you know, from a VC fund perspective, in terms of how they do their planning, traditionally for every 10 investments that they make, they expect to hit 2 or 3 of them out of the park, probably 2, make money on another 3, and like minimal money, and completely lose all their money on the others. So it's still, if you think of baseball batting odds, odds is still pretty low. And I think we could do a much better job of that. And so there's a whole new breed. If you think about some of the micro seed funds and angel investing that has sprung up and really filled a big gap in the last few years. One of the things I really like about that model is that you can place the big bets. You know, you can ride a story that's going to be really big, but because you're putting in small amounts of capital and because you're getting in right at the beginning, you can still, on a repeat basis, make money along with the entrepreneurs if they exit early. So, and it's never easy to get to an exit ever, but it is relatively easier to exit for 10 million bucks than it is to exit for 50, right? And on a probabilities basis, you're much more likely to exit for a more modest amount than you are for a bigger amount. So I think that this new investing model that's coming up now, particularly focused on capital efficient web startups, will lead to higher percentage of companies that reach exit. And you are seeing in big companies a bigger and bigger trend towards outsourcing innovation, right? And they're buying it. And you are seeing bigger companies getting used to buying Canadian startups. There's a good base of operations here. You're seeing some big shops, big web companies now establishing offices here. LinkedIn is the latest. I've set up a big shop in Ontario. So it all bodes well, I think, for the future of the Canadian startup community. Yeah, successful Montreal startups. So yeah, there have been a bunch. And again, if I go way back to the early days, Discrete Logic was one of the biggest successes. Avid Media, Softimage, those have been big successes and have spawned a lot of I guess serial entrepreneurs. People who've been part of those companies have funded either VC funds or have funded startups directly, so they've fed back into the system. It's been really important. You know, I think more recently, I was actually part of a pretty successful exit a few years back with a storage company named TerraScale Technologies, and we put $4 million of capital into that. We sold it for 47 million bucks 3 years later. We did very well on that. More recently, tough to think of. I mean, I guess the biggest exit that has happened in recent memory here in town is Oz Communications, which was a really big player offering instant messaging services to big mobile carriers like AT&T, and that sold for 230 million bucks, which is definitely one of the bigger exits in recent memory here in town. There's a few companies that I'm really excited about now that are starting to hit critical mass that haven't yet achieved exit. And of course, you can be successful and not have exited yet, right? It's really just about building something relevant, having a big user base. And so Tungle, which is one of the companies I'm involved in, I'm also an investor in that company, I really think is killing it. And when I was at South by Southwest this year, that's a really big show, like 15,000 people there, all from the internet industry, and Tungle was everywhere. Our presence was really felt, and I've really seen that on a user and usage basis, the company is just doing phenomenally well. So, I'm knocking on wood that that's going to be, fast forward a few years, that's going to be a big Montreal success story.